Welcome to our forum on global supply chain resilience and U.S. cybersecurity. The global supply chain of food, fuel, medicine, and other essential goods depends upon resilient cyberspace, but hackers are increasingly targeting key providers in the global economy. Those of us on the East Coast will recall the Colonial Pipeline incident that resulted in fuel supply chain disruptions. Senior White House National Security Council officials join us to discuss how the nation can develop new policies and deploy advanced technologies to detect, prevent, and deter future supply chain attacks. This forum is sponsored by the Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs, the Hume Center for National Security and Technology at Virginia Tech, and the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative. I'm Jeff Reed, Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Virginia Tech, and I'm co-moderator of this event. And I also serve as CTO of the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, a state organization that works with Virginia universities to enable cybersecurity research and experiential learning.
And I'm Patrick Roberts. I'm an Associate Professor of Public Administration and Policy in Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs, and I'm the other co-moderator of this event. Our guests are first, Jason Tama. Jason is the Deputy of the National Security Council's Resilience and Response Directorate. And in this role, Jason oversees national policy in a number of areas, including domestic preparedness, incident response, hazard mitigation and recovery, and critical infrastructure, security and resilience. Jason is detailed to the NSC from the U.S. Coast Guard, where he most recently served as captain of the Port of New York and New Jersey. Welcome, Jason. Lucky to have you.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
And Caitlin Durkovich couldn't be here today because of a last-minute conflict, but we're really lucky to have Jason, who works very closely with her. And our second guest is Jeff Green. Jeff is the Chief of Cyber Response and Policy at the National Security Council, and Jeff previously served as the Director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. Prior to that, he worked as Vice President of Global Government Affairs and Policy at Symantec. And before Symantec, Jeff worked on both the House and Senate Homeland Security committees. Welcome, Jeff.
Great. Thanks for having me here today.
We're following a fireside chat format. Our agenda will consist of asking our panelists several prepared questions. Audience questions are also being solicited, and we'll convey selected questions from our audience. So as we proceed, feel free to type your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So let's get started with our first question. Jason, by now, all Americans have experienced some form of supply chain disruption firsthand as a result of the COVID pandemic. We've all seen the images of container ships stacked outside the port of Long Beach. How should we think about this problem in terms of resilience? And what do we need to do in the long term as a nation to ensure that we don't face this situation in the future?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. And I want to thank Virginia Tech for putting this forum together and for the opportunity to be with you here today. It's a great question on the supply chain. And let me start by rewinding the tape a little bit and talk briefly a little bit about how we got here with the COVID pandemic. And I think for the first time in many Americans' lives, they got to see the impacts very close to home of a supply chain disruption, the likes of which we probably haven't seen since the oil crisis in the late 70s, or perhaps even going back to World War II. In terms of the level of disruption. And Americans saw this, whether we were talking toilet paper, computer chips, other goods that we rely on our transportation system and our supply chains to deliver for us. So, there's an old saying that God might have been a ship owner, in that when God created the earth, he covered it with ocean and put the raw materials very far from where they would be needed the most. And that's the nature of our global supply chain. And I think we've seen this impact, and we've also learned that gone are the days where we can take comfort alone here in the United States from our geographic position. You know, we've had this position where we're isolated from our enemies, if you will, for generations. We have two oceans. We've been in a really great position geographically. And now we've seen how a disruption from overseas, whether it's a cyber attack or a global pandemic, can have reverberating impacts through the supply chain here at home. So, you know, the answer in the long term is to deal with the crisis we have before us. I guess I'll start with the near term first, which ultimately depends on getting the COVID pandemic under control, but also taking a number of steps going forward to use this opportunity to really make our supply chain more resilient. And that means diversification. You know, we can't make everything we need here at home, so we have to be diversified. It means increased transparency and visibility throughout the entire supply chain, from raw materials to manufacturing to transportation to consumption, so that we can get ahead and forecast and anticipate some of these disruptions. And it means a more sustainable system as well. You know, transportation in particular is the number one emitter right now for greenhouse gases. And it means a more secure system. Jeff and I will talk about some of the threats that we face, and we have to have a more secure system going forward. And that's the key to a resilient supply chain. And this is a crisis that we're dealing with right now, or challenges that we're dealing with right now. We've made a lot of progress, and you know, the president has had a number of initiatives, including an executive order and a recent supply chain summit to really bring our allies in and lead in this space.
Jeff Green, I understand the administration is concerned with the aspects of supply chain resilience that Jason talked about, related to ensuring people get reliable access to products and services. But there are also concerns with securing the integrity of particular supply chains, like software. So Jeff, can you say a bit about the nature of that problem and why it matters?
Sure. And, you know, I was struck when Jason was talking about the geographic isolation of the United States. Living in the cyber world, that's not a luxury that we've ever had. There are cliche no borders in cyberspace, and that goes for the potential ways to disrupt the software supply chain. You don't have to look any further than the SolarWinds incident, which was late last year into this year, to see the kind of impact that can be had when a bad actor gets into the software supply chain. In that case, it was an updating of software. So it is something we've been focused on. It's not a new problem. I think we've put a particular focus on it in the administration since President Biden came in. Most noteworthy, I'll talk in a second about the Executive Order 14028, which the president signed out in April, as a particular section that's focused directly at software supply chain. But in terms of why it's an issue, if you look at any device today that has a computer chip in it, which is almost anything we have, from you know, a Happy Meal toy to a car that has thousands of chips in it, there is software running in them, and that software is developed in a variety of different places in a variety of different ways. Much of it includes open source libraries and open source components that are built into it. So understanding the provenance of all of the code that goes into a device, keeping it patched and updated, is extraordinarily hard, and it is not a purely solvable problem. It is, like a lot of risks, it is something that we have to manage, mitigate, and accept. With respect to the software supply chain provisions that we have put forward, we're focused on the United States government. The president, through his authority that he has now, can direct what the US government does. So what he did in this executive order was to say that approximately a year from the issuance of the executive order, the United States government will not be buying software or devices with software that are not developed in a secure method. The executive order lays out some specific provisions that we think will lead to that type of security. In essence, there are these secure software development lifecycle frameworks out there. It ties to many of them. So we cite a lot of those pieces. But the other thing that the executive order did was direct my home agency, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to develop a public-private effort to come up with what are those best practices, how to implement them effectively and cost-effectively, and also how best to report it. We don't want to create an environment where people are checking the box on security and not actually taking the steps to improve the security. Now, as I said, this is focused on US government software, but we believe and expect that it will have a pretty significant impact on the software all of us use. I don't think there are going to be a lot of companies who are going to develop a complicated software package that they'll sell to the government and then develop a less secure version that they will sell to the private sector. This is not a short-term fix. It will take a while for many of these companies to fully integrate these efforts, but we have already heard significant feedback from companies that they have taken steps to improve their software. And some of them, it's simply a matter of reviewing their practices. I've talked to some companies that said, yeah, we're doing all of this. We thought we were doing all of this, but your executive order, the president's executive order, spurred us to do a review of what we're doing. And as a result of it, we found some gaps that we can fill. So I'm hopeful that in the long term, you will see software that has fewer vulnerabilities built into it, which will make the life harder for the malicious actors who take advantage of those software errors.
Earlier this year, many of us experienced a cyber-related supply chain disruption at gas stations, the Colonial Pipeline incident. And I understand both of you worked on the response. Jeff and Jason, can you talk us through that incident so that we can understand how you both worked together, what questions you asked, how many agencies were involved in the response, and what did we learn from the situation?
Give it a shot to start.
Sure, I'll give it a shot.
Hot potato.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very important question, and it was an incident that had an impact on a number of on millions of Americans. And interestingly, Jeff and I were talking this morning. I was actually, my first week at the White House was the Monday after the Colonial Pipeline incident, and one of the first things that one of my first tasks was to do exactly what you suggested, which was take a look at the incident and see what do we have to learn from this, and how can we be best prepared, not only from a private sector perspective, but from a government perspective for these types of incidents. And it's something we do. We take a hard look always after any major incident to say what are the lessons learned, and what do we need to take away to be prepared. I would say, from my perspective, and Jeff will have important perspective on this as well. One of the most significant things we learned was this growing interconnectedness between the cyber and physical domains, and specifically how an incident, which is a ransomware incident, an asymmetric threat vector, if you will, from overseas, could attack an IT system via ransomware and have this cascading impact that would actually have this tremendous physical impact on the pipeline itself. And we can go into details about what Colonial did or didn't do in the response, but I think at the end of the day, the pipeline was shut down for a variety of reasons, and it had a significant impact. And one thing that we learned, you used to be able to say, protect your operational technology. If we protect the operational technology through air gaps and other means, we should be good. We won't have impacts. But as we've learned, from this incident and many incidents prior to this, but I think this one really highlighted something that we've been talking about in the security space for quite some time. The air gap is a myth. And because of our dependencies on technology and the integration between information systems and how we operate our critical infrastructure, if you can get to the IT and have a significant impact on the whole system. And we have to have that in mind in terms of how we protect ourselves and how we build resilience into these systems.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk in a second about, I was fortunate enough to be on duty the Friday into the weekend as it broke. But I want to pick up on something Jason said, which is the fact that a pure IT incident could cause information technology, cause this type of shutdown of key operational technology. And it was because it's very hard for any organization or company to have faith in the air gap Jason was talking about. The line that companies since then have used as well is they're shutting their technology out of an abundance of caution. That is simply a fear that the infection could spread. So the dark humor that I used since then is, I went to bed that Friday night much more concerned than I woke up that Friday morning, because I really hadn't conceptualized just how a pure IT incident, this was a ransomware incident on their business systems, could have an OT impact. And I know that our adversaries and criminals were watching and learning from that. But in terms of the response, there were a variety of agencies, as you might expect: Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, and the White House, the Homeland Security Advisor, National Security Advisor's Office. We were engaged with Department of Transportation. But we do have policies and procedures that have been in place across administrations in terms of how you manage particular incidents. And those kicked in, and the effort was led by a cross-sector of agencies. And in the middle of it, we weren't really talking about, is this a cyber or physical incident? We were talking sort of parallel about, we need to ensure the fuel supply. We need to make sure that people understand that, yes, this is an issue, but this is not a major, it's major, not an issue that's going to cause a gas station to run dry forever. But we also needed to address the underlying cyber issues. But in the aftermath of that Jason talked about, that's where we had the time to step back and look at how were we conceptualizing this as a cyber or physical incident. And one conversation that struck me that really crystallized that we need to take a step back and think about how we respond to incidents like this is, we were talking about this, and someone was saying, well, sure, it was a cyber related incident that caused it, but once the pipeline went down, it was all about energy, and we just had to figure about how we're going to flow gas. And I remember sitting there and thinking, but the reason we can't flow gas is because we don't have confidence in the IT. And it was not, so I jumped in and said, it's not to say this is cyber, not physical, it is both, and we need to stop splitting the two, and we need to figure out and make sure that our responses are addressing them as one. And that's where the tie-in between the Resilience Directorate and the Cyber Directorate has been so important. When anything pops up on the screen that we think may be an issue, Jason and I get on the phone, Caitlin and my boss will get on the phone. Some collection of us connects up very quickly to do a quick assessment to make sure that we are organized across those lines of effort, and we're not just seeing it as, okay, this is cyber, so deal with it that way. I mean, there are some exceptions at the other end. Forest fires was not a heavy cyber incident. It certainly kept Jason busy for quite a while, but many of the things we face are going to have both cyber and physical components.
Thanks very much for that helpful context of how decision-making works. That's great insight. And this is a good example for us to pivot to the topic of critical infrastructure. And Colonial Pipeline and pipeline security is one example of critical infrastructure, along with transportation, telecom, water, et cetera. And we just had a large $1 trillion, I believe, infrastructure bill passed into law. So Jason, can you talk a bit about the current state of our critical infrastructure and your assessment of how secure, how reliable it is, and then what type of impact is this new legislation expected to have? What's it going to do for security and resilience?
Yeah, sure. I think it's describing the state broadly of our national critical infrastructure doesn't, in terms of security and reliability, doesn't necessarily resolve itself to a simple soundbite. We have a huge foundation of critical infrastructure in the United States. The vast majority of it is owned by the private sector. You've talked about the breadth of infrastructure sectors, from transportation, electricity, communications, water, you name it. The president's been clear on this, on his assessment of the state of our infrastructure, and why he pushed so hard for passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and how significant that's going to be. And it truly is a once in a generation investment in our infrastructure and our competitiveness, our efficiency, and if we get it right, our resilience as well. And I think all you have to do is look in the rear view mirror at things like Colonial Pipeline. I can also talk about hurricanes, Hurricane Ida this summer, which had a devastating impact on Louisiana, New Orleans, and all the way through the Mississippi Valley, Ohio Valley, Tennessee Valley, up to New York and New Jersey. That hurricane took down over 30,000 power poles in the state of Louisiana alone, which was more power poles than all of the named storms that hit Louisiana the year prior. Last year, we had 22 climate-related storms that had a total damage of over $1 billion. The 40-year average, adjusted for inflation, of those number of incidents in a year that exceed $1 billion in damage is 7. So this soundbite of that we talk about of increasing numbers of disasters, more extreme disasters caused by climate change, the facts are there. So not only, I think is vulnerability in the threat picture changing from both cyber and climate change, you do have those inherent vulnerabilities in our infrastructure and the lack of investment for many, many years, decades. And so the hope is this helps us turn the corner on that front. And as Jeff and I have discussed extensively, and we've talked about with our colleagues here in the White House, it's key to get these resilience principles to design the billions of dollars that we are investing in, whether it's transportation, clean energy, new water systems, that we increase our efficiency, but at the same time, we close some of those vulnerability gaps, whether it's cyber or resilience to physical impacts, to ensure that this investment, these changes, as Jeff likes to say, are baked in from the get-go, so we do this right.
Great. Having you both on stage is somewhat symbolic of the growing convergence between cyber and physical domains, and that we cannot silo these security domains. What do we need to understand with regards to the convergence of cyber and physical security domains, both in terms of vulnerabilities and opportunities?
So I pick up on the resilience point that Jason made as we're building out new infrastructure generally. Resilience to cyber-related incidents is not just information and cybersecurity. If you look back to the attacks on the Ukrainian electric grid 5-6 years ago, one of the reasons that they were able to respond and come back up quickly was they had physical controls that allowed them to get the systems back up and running again. So but that was because they were old, not because they were new. But to Jason's point about baking things in, as we look up, as we build these systems that are increasingly connected, almost entirely connected now, some are remote operated, it is important that we, this is going to sound awful, plan for the worst possible case, whether it is a malicious compromise, a loss of power, or some other interruption of connectivity. We need to be able to run systems without just a digital interface. It is hard to conceive of any new major infrastructure system that is not going to have a digital component, whether it is a highway with embedded sensors that provides updates on the status of the roadways or the strength of the bridge, or it's buying a refrigerator at home. I mean, I don't have nor want a connected refrigerator. I don't know that in the future I will have a choice but to buy one. I remember the first time I saw connected TVs, I thought it was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard of. And now my kids watch their streaming services direct through the television. So we are moving to a world where things will be increasingly connected, and more the connected is not just to the bits, the ones and zeros, it's connected to the physical movement. So it is where we are. But one of the last things I'll say when I'm talking about the popular phrase, the Internet of Things devices, I worked on a study for the President's National Security and Telecommunications Advisory Committee about 7-8 years ago. And one of the things that we put in our report is it is important to look at the end result of your design, of your product, not in terms of what you want it to do. People tend to imbue personalities into things they build and design. You need to look at what it is capable of doing and what someone else on the outside who wants to perhaps do bad things can look at that and do with it. So as we're looking at those connected devices, we always need to be trying to conceptualize what can be done, not what we want to be done with them.
And I would just add, I don't want a connected refrigerator either. I can't. And I'm trying hard to think why I would need one, but we'll take that offline. I would add on to some of Jeff's points. just foot stomping on the criticality of if you are an infrastructure owner or operator or somebody that provides an entity that provides a vital service, you have to anticipate these potential outcomes. We've made these huge investments, and we've talked about this for years, that have enhanced efficiency and connectivity and created great benefits for our societies. But we've also created tremendous vulnerabilities, and we need to start figuring out how to close those. And you don't have to try too hard to imagine, because we've seen it. We saw it in March with the Colonial Pipeline, and we've seen it from many other incidents, that the threats are out there and the vulnerabilities are out there. And you don't, again, I come back to the same point. You don't have to have necessarily a ultra sophisticated attack on an operational technology or industrial control system to achieve the outcome you need to achieve. If you lose your information system and you can't go back to pens and paper and clipboards or whatever you use, and your entire operation comes to a halt, that's not a very resilient system.
And these appliance examples, I think, are really good at illustrating how complex systems are nowadays. And within those systems are often embedded software that are made up of themselves complex things, from custom code to open source libraries. And much of this, as you know, is developed outside of the United States. And it's not just refrigerators and TVs, it's our computers, it's our printers, our watches, phones, even toys. And so all of these things need to be patched and updated. You talked about the Internet of Things. So my question is, are there processes or technologies that can help ensure the integrity of this software supply chain that go into our things and our devices, and what's being done to address this issue?
I noted that you said that these devices need to be patched and updated, but they most often are not, even the things that are readily patched and updated. Hopefully by now, if is your car patching and updating itself? Is all the chips embedded in it, or your connected doorbell? So that is one of the most important pieces, is making sure that you have devices that are being kept up to date, because no matter how hard we try to develop a product securely on the front end, it will need to be patched and updated later on. And if we add new functionality through updates later on, introduces new vulnerabilities, potentially, again, need to make sure that you're patching and updating them. But we simply don't know that even the best piece of software or the best piece of embedded software that shipped today, whether it is secure. So I view it from kind of two lenses: is make it as secure as possible, and also have a plan to deal with it as you find vulnerabilities. So making it as secure as possible. I talked about secure software development. There are key elements to that. It's everything from making sure that you're running modern tools and efforts to check the code for vulnerabilities that are known and easy to find, because to Jason's point about it's not that hard to compromise devices. Most compromises that happen today are happening either through bad practices of people or through bad coding practices or other vulnerabilities that have been known for 20 years. So we are making the same mistakes. And many of those are detectable through automated and other tools as you're building a process. But it's also things like, as you have the environment, the computing environment where you're building your software, the development environment, that needs to be separate and secure from your business environment. So you cannot have a really sophisticated actor break in and go into it and compromise the code that's being written. That was the incident, the case with SolarWinds. So there are a lot of elements to building it securely, but I think we were talking about more in the back end, is there are tools that you can apply to your code before you release it to check it for known vulnerabilities. Open source, you mentioned, is a really tough problem. We talked about that a lot as we were developing the executive order. In the end, we do put the obligation on the developer to try to ensure both the provenance and the quality of the code. So it's fine to build in open source libraries. It's not fine to build it in, plug it in, and assume it's good and safe because someone else developed it and it's been open for review. You need to take some ownership of what you're putting in. And the final piece I would say is, the phrase that's used in the executive order is the software bill of materials, knowing what code, what libraries are built in. So if if I have 100 different pieces of software running in my enterprise, and a vulnerability is found in a known, widely used open source library, I need to be able to quickly find out where I'm actually using that. And if I don't know what has gone into the 100 different pieces of software I have, it will be incredibly hard for me to know where to patch. So that is one of the elements in the executive order, is development of software bills and materials. Last thing I'd say is, on that note, I don't want to say I was skeptical. I was curious about the actual value of the SBOMs. And this was one, but we were talking to a chief information security officer at a major healthcare facility. And he was very strongly in support of software bills and materials. And he said, in the end, I don't really care what's in it. I care that the developer can produce it. Because if I ask for the SBOM and they can't do it, that tells me something about the level of rigor that they have in their development processes. And that was really, that told me a lot. So hope I answered your question. A lot of different pieces of it. None of it's easy. And, we are always managing risk. We need to know that we live in a world with vulnerabilities, and we need to manage them.
Interesting. Do both of you view the reliance of having to import technical workers for critical technologies as a supply chain issue?
I'm happy to share a few comments on that. I think I appreciate you bringing up workforce in general in terms of the importance to our supply chain, importance to our national security and economic security in general. I'll go back to the points I talked about supply chain when we started the conversation, and and having a resilient supply chain and a diversified supply chain. So I think we have workforce challenges across the United States in a number of areas. And I think when we think about workforce, we think of diversification and sustainability as critical as well. And there's a balance there between bringing talent and skilled workers from overseas, which we have a long history of doing that through a safe, secure, sustainable immigration system, and what we can produce here at home. And I think, a similar model when we think about supply chain resilience, as I was speaking about earlier, we need to think the same way in terms of workforce and human capital. And we have to think about the problems the challenges that we face right now that are not insurmountable, but they are significant challenges. And we need to make sure we're investing in our human capital to make sure that we can do what we need to do going forward.
I would say I don't know that we have talked about the need for a technical and skilled workforce in the context of supply chain. I think it fits well with it. You could put it in there. The one point that I would emphasize, at least on the security side, Jason mentioned is the diversity of your workforce. If you're trying to build products or identify security threats, if you have a group of people who all think the same and look the same and are coming up with ways that you think something is vulnerable, you're missing a whole world of vulnerabilities, because the human element of risk, the human element of how to do a compromise is essential. So you need to build that diversity into your workforce, if only because you will have a better, more secure product and environment at the end of it. So that is not, if we're going to view it as a supply chain, that is an essential piece of the workforce supply chain in my mind.
We have a number of students interested in international affairs, foreign policy here, and so some of them were wondering, Jason, what are the most important global forums for strengthening supply chain resilience, and then also for addressing the cybersecurity issues related to supply chain resilience?
Sure. The easy answer there is all of them. But I'll give you just a little bit more. I think the president has made clear, one of the pillars of the administration's approach to national security in general is engaging aggressively with our partners and our allies and internationally to address some of these challenges, some of the most pressing challenges that we face and that our allies and partners face. And supply chain is one of them, cybersecurity is one of them, resilience is one of them. And I think you see these themes popping up in any international forum you can think of where the United States has been engaging. I'll give a couple of examples. Most recently, the president did convene a supply chain summit on the margins of the G20 at the end of October, to really, in recognition that some of these challenges that we face are global and they're shared by our partners, and talking about how we can establish the secure and resilient and sustainable supply chains that I talked about earlier. We're also working closely with our NATO partners to enhance resilience as well. The NATO summit this summer, there was a specific commitment to agree to strengthen resilience across all of the different NATO partners. And this is both an economic and a national security issue for the United States. OECD, the Quad, I could name a number of different forums where the US is engaging, and they're all important to tackling this issue.
Well, it's time for some questions from the audience. Let me remind people that if they'd like to submit a question, you can tap the Q&A button right at the bottom of the Zoom screen and type something in. We already have a few questions, and let me begin with the first one. The first question comes from Nishith Tripathi. Hello, do you expect any policy incentives to US companies and academic institutions to ensure the supply chain of critical communications equipment for our nation, e.g. 5 and 6G, by reducing reliance on other nations?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part of the question?
The last part of the question was, do you expect any policy incentives to US companies and academic institutions to ensure supply chain of critical communications equipment and reducing the reliability by reducing the reliance on other nations? In other words, what sort of policies, if any, do you envision to help reduce the supply chain issues for items such as 5 and 6G equipment? What sort of policy incentives might be there for both universities and industries?
I don't know about specific to university or industries. I do know that I'm blanking on the legislation, but the Congress did create a program to try to incentivize, and I think there was some funding provided to ensure that smaller carriers are using secure 5G technology, and to try to drive the use of that more secure 5G technologies. In the last administration, there were a couple of supply chain executive orders, which I think looked at trying to drive secure supply chain practices in 5G. 6G, the standards are in development right now. I think seeing how that comes forward, the US government, I think is working with private sector partners to try to make sure we're engaged in those development of where those standards go. But within 5G, there are a lot of security tools, security features available. So it's not just the devices you use, it's making sure you have a secure deployment in 5G. If not to plug my home entity, but where I came from, the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence at NIST, I guess it's almost 8 months ago now, but we were then kicking off an effort on secure 5G deployments, working with some of the major carriers. So what will come out of that is ultimately a practice guide, which will have very specific descriptions on how organizations can put in place a secure 5G deployment that will hopefully provide them security that you just can't get in 4G. It does different menu options of the different security tools available. So I encourage folks to look at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, the NCCOE, and you'll find on their homepage a description and progress on that 5G project.
And the only thing I'll add on top of that is if you want to learn more about some of the supply chain work more broadly on the diversification pieces, take a look at the president's executive order on supply chains from February, which kicked off a number of very aggressive reviews of specific elements of our supply chain, specific nationally critical elements of our supply chain, and then ongoing longer term reviews on a sector by sector basis to look at some of these issues and take action.
Thank you, Jason. And on that, we have a question from a member of the audience who was reviewing the infrastructure bill, now law and executive orders, and asked if you could talk a bit more about efforts to decrease technological dependencies on suppliers outside of the United States for chips, boards, embedded software, or all kinds of other things.
Yeah, sure. And I know Jeff has some thoughts on this as well. I think I'll point you again to the supply chain review as well, which, you know, this was one of the fundamental elements of this, taking a look at that and born out of some of the challenges that I spoke about in the beginning that we saw from the COVID pandemic and our reliance on supplies from overseas. You know, reshoring everything in the United States is not realistic. Everybody knows that, and probably wouldn't necessarily achieve the best economic outcomes. So I come back to this diversification and this sustainability piece. And part of the supply chain review was also looking at critical national strategic stockpiles. What do we need? What do we need? Do we have the right ones? How big do they need to be, et cetera? You know, so there's a number of efforts underway on that. And I think related to the infrastructure bill in particular, you know, I think is just the broader investment in our critical infrastructure, which I think will have tremendous benefits, either secondary or tertiary benefits on some of the issues that we're talking about. I know Jeff may have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, Jason's initial point, we're not going to reshore everything is important. And that goes back to something we've hit on a few points, which is understanding the risk that you're taking on and then managing it as best you can. And part of that is identifying like what are key things that we really actually do need to reshore, things we do need to develop in the United States that we can have some level of confidence on. But I think we also can't be fooled into thinking that simply developing something in the United States will bring with it a level of security just because. So we need to go back to the software, at least in the software world, the development practices I talked about it. We need to develop it in the United States and develop it securely. We need to understand we're going to be pulling libraries and code and other pieces from around the world and have tools in place to ensure that we're looking at them securely and making sure they're secure. I would point to, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. There were 2 executive orders late in the last administration, infrastructure as a service, I believe, and another on supply chain security. The Department of Commerce is implementing those right now. And those are looking at some of the key pieces of it. But it will be a matter of identifying critical needs and picking the places to apply our resources.
Okay. We actually have a question from one of our viewers in London, Sally Daughtry. She asked, "Thank you for your insightful discussion of these broad and challenging issues. A question for both speakers. Do you consider cyber threat intelligence sharing should now be built in to our collaborations on critical infrastructure cross borders? We have this already through e.g. NATO exchanges, but can this be mandated in the private sector?"
I mean, it could be mandated. It can't be mandated by the president absent existing authority in statute or in the Constitution. So at least in the United States, we would need Congress to build a mandate. And in fact, Congress is right now considering legislation about incident reporting generally, and then with respect to ransomware incidents as well. The underlying question of cyber threat information sharing, we have as a cybersecurity community made tremendous progress in the past 15 years and still have a long way to go. I've seen it from many different sides now. My initial entree into it when I was a staffer in Congress working on cybersecurity legislation starting in 2009, and information sharing was a piece of it. And then 8 years when I was at Symantec, when we were both sharing information with the government, getting information back from the government, I would say not just, but also hoping to get information from the government and not always getting as much as we thought or we thought would be helpful. And we worked with government partners on how to get that information out. but we also shared with governments outside the United States. Symantec was a global company. But now the hat I wear today, where I see the information that we have in the United States government, I see what we can share out and what we need from the private sector. And having sat in all those different places, I would say that my biggest takeaway, and I can apply it to the global landscape in a second, is that it is fundamentally true that what the government sees is very different from what the private sector sees in the cybersecurity landscape. And I don't know of another domain that is like that. There is some overlap, but we, the government, do not see the vast majority of malicious activity for very good and very providential reasons. Most folks, at least in the United States, watching this, don't want us sitting on their private networks watching what's going on. But if we're not there, it's hard for us to know exactly what the bad stuff is. But someone else is on those systems, the companies trying to run them securely and protect their customers. So our ability to share effectively with them is important. But the same is true. Activity that goes on outside the United States can often be very different from what we see here. We do have very good sharing relationships with a variety of countries that has made us all secure in some ways, some public and some non-public ways. So let me just, I've been going a while, but the mandating piece is what's hard. I do think that where the government has the authority, and it is essential that we get some information. You've seen a push by some regulators to mandate ransomware incidents. One of my jobs here is helping to lead the White House's oversight of the great work that the various agencies are doing to try to go after these criminal actors. I'm asked on a regular basis, at least weekly, what is the baseline? Are we seeing progress? And the answer is we don't know the baseline because we don't get the reporting. I think it would be very useful to have some type of strongly incentivized or mandatory reporting, because these are, after all, criminal incidents. And you have seen publicly the FBI has been able to claw back some ransomware payments. They can't do that if they don't know about the incident. So that's one area where I think that you could see some progress in the United States. Perhaps sector by sector, you've seen Treasury mandate some stuff. The SEC might. You might see some financial stuff. But even more generally, if Congress says, look, critical infrastructure, you have an incident, it's important that the appropriate agencies know. Sorry, I ran for a while.
No. The only thing I think I would add is and I'll put a U.S. lens on it. I think Jeff covered the international piece. You see different levels of, I would say, propensity to share information, perhaps across different sectors, and particularly in the critical infrastructure side. And part of that's related to the level of diversification or centralization of the sector, how they're coordinated, the interdependencies as well. And I think there is recognition, speaking of the private sector to private sector piece, of this growing interdependence. And unlike a physical event that can be generally bound by physical constraints, some of the threats we face in the cyber domain can propagate, obviously, at the speed of light and aren't limited by those same constraints. So I think there is growing recognition, within the private sector on some of the importance of this and the benefits to all of sharing information. But I think we still have a long way to go on that front.
Thanks very much. So I'm hearing there are a lot of differences among sectors. So this is a very complex issue. We have some technical experts, cybersecurity experts here, and engineers, and so we had a few policy questions about how things work in government. So we have one from Gary Brown, who wants to know, well, is there one agency within the federal government, which is tasked with organizing, understanding, and solving these problems, meaning I think supply chain security, resilience, and cybersecurity, or if not, why not? And is that not exactly how it works? So is one person in charge, or is it a different kind of problem and system?
The answer is, I would say there is no one person in charge, because the breadth of what you described, from physical supply chain to digital supply chain to security of the pieces of it, is going to cross a whole bunch of different, I think, legitimate interests. I mean, the closest I think we would have is the relatively new Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, which is part of DHS. They have overall authority for civilian critical infrastructure, both cyber and physical. The piece of it that they don't necessarily have is all the different elements of supply chain. But within that, it is important to recognize that a couple things. CISA will never have the expertise to understand the nuances of the food and agricultural sector. And if you look at food and ag, it is everything from big companies like Cisco that deliver food to small grain cooperatives to farmers. They're even within food and ag, the Department of Agriculture, it's hard to imagine any one person that could have knowledge over that. But when these agencies work together, when, for instance, there were a couple of incidents related to some grain cooperatives a few months back, CISA is looking at the cyber element. Department of Agriculture has the knowledge to understand what impact that may have on the sector, on the food chain. So when we convene here, we are looking for those agencies to provide us the expertise that is specific to them. And then when you think about going forward, changing policy to identify or to solve any problems that were identified, Food and Ag and Agriculture Department may focus on the specific to the supply chain within that sector. CISA may look more broadly at what are the generalized cross-sector issues that we've seen. I don't know if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, and I mean, just in terms of organization, the question of how we organize, just to add a layer on what Jeff said, is this concept of sector risk management agencies. And again, I'll put it on the critical infrastructure piece, where we have multiple sectors of critical infrastructure and designated sector risk management agencies, who are the department or agency that have the expertise. Perhaps in some cases, they've regulated or provided oversight for that sector for decades and decades and decades. They have relationships with the industry. They've built the expertise in their workforce that have deep understanding of those supply chains and those pieces. And I think that is the model that we've used with the overarching technical expertise on cyber from CISA and others. And it is an ongoing conversation. And we're always looking at, do we have the right model, the right organization for this challenging problem and the changing world that we live in. But I think, going back to diversification as well, sustainability, just as general principles, it would be impossible for a one-size-fits-all single node to do what we wanted to do, and probably would create some significant vulnerabilities where we need to enhance this awareness, this expertise, this understanding of the need to build resilience, just like we push that it's a risk that needs to be holistically managed with the private sector. The same approach here in government. It's a whole team effort.
Great. I have a question from an anonymous attendee. Do you see the federal government investing more R&D in educational research entities to spearhead efforts for secure resilience?
Yes, I mean, it is one of the areas in our directorate, but there are several organizations, different parts of the government that are driving education, but we are not going to get to a managed risk environment without education. And it's starting at the K through 12 level. We need to have kids learning secure practices, getting interested in security beyond their own security. But yeah, I think you will see efforts by the government. There is legislation that has been introduced in various ways. I think there was a bill that the president signed touching on a small piece of technical education, cyber education a few weeks ago. So that is definitely a key component of getting more secure.
Yeah, and just real quickly for an example on the physical side, on R&D in particular, we've engaged some of the national labs who are doing tremendous research and prototyping opportunities to make our infrastructure more resilient. For example, our electrical power grid, and how can we build more resilience to the impacts of climate change, reduce the risk of wildfires. So this is an area of focus on established national labs and R&D as well.
Great, and thanks so much for taking questions from our audience. That they really appreciate it. I want to close with a question from a student and looking towards the future. And we have a student, Elizabeth Quill, thinking about a future and critical infrastructure resilience of transportation systems. And Jason, I know you're a captain of Port of New York, New Jersey, and certainly have a big picture view in your current position. So she wants to know, how will cybersecurity resilience impact the future of interconnected transportation systems, whether it's rail, ports, roads, and what kind of things should she be thinking about as she builds her career and comes up with new ideas for bringing together cybersecurity and physical critical infrastructure systems and building these transit systems and making our supply chains run smoothly.
I mean, I have just a couple quick thoughts, and I'm sure Jeff has thoughts as well. And it's a great question, Elizabeth. Thank you, and I'm glad you're interested in pursuing a career in critical infrastructure and the integration of the convergence of the cyber and physical domains. And I think when I'll just give a example that's close to home. When I think about, say, the transportation sector or the maritime sector, we have a number of folks in that workforce that have come up, were trained and involved with and saw some of this integration, but haven't lived it from day one. You will be coming into the workforce at a time when there's more connectivity and integration between the cyber and physical domains than we've ever seen, period, and greater interconnectedness and the Internet of Things. And so we need people like you that can help tackle these problems and work us into the future, in a future where we hope we are more efficient, more competitive, and also more resilient at the same time. And I think our future is bright on that front, and I'm excited for what your career lies ahead.
I mean, I go kind of where Jason went. The way you, Elizabeth, framed that question is exactly right, which is that you're thinking about all of these things at once. You're not thinking, I need to build an efficient transportation mode. You're thinking, I need to build an efficient and secure transportation mode. To the point Jason made about you're going to be entering a workforce of people who may have been doing this a long time. It may be hard, particularly as a new employee, but resist the notion that we do this way because we've always done it. Particularly as we roll out the investment in the Infrastructure Act, we cannot build new things the way we always have, or we're not going to be building the security we need for today in them. So push back when people tell you, because that's the way we do it. Make sure that you're focusing on getting security in at the front end, because ultimately that will lead to the more efficient transportation or whatever on the back end.
Great. Thank you so much. We'd really like to thank our panelists, Jason Tama and Jeff Green, for participating in this forum, fireside chat, and sharing their insights into supply chain issues. And thanks to participants for their questions and attention. And we'd also like to thank the organizers, Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs, the Hume Center for National Security and Technology at Virginia Tech, and the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative. Have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you.